great turnout. My name is Bill Burke. I'm the Cape Cod National Seashore Historian. And this afternoon we have a very fascinating program in which many people are involved. I want to thank the Eastham 400 Committee for putting a series of programs together. How many of you were here for the first program here at the Visitor Center with Dr. Bragdon? Okay, great. And how many of you in the audience live at least part-time in Eastham? That's a lot, okay. Well, again, welcome. We go back in time 400 years to December of 1620, and the focus of the program is on the first encounter in Eastham, but really we're going to try to step back and build a context for what was happening in 1620. So that's what today's program is about. So thanks again for attending. I want to introduce at this time Bob C. Bob is right behind me. All right. And Bob is on the Eastham 400 Committee, which is to commemorate the 400th anniversary of the Pilgrims on Cape Cod and the encounters with the native peoples who were here. And he will be introducing the rest of the speakers, so enjoy it. Thank you, Bob.
And thank you, Bill. And welcome to everyone. This is actually the third of several programs that the 400 Committee is sponsoring. And I thought before we get too deeply into today's subject, we'd hear from our chairman, Jim Russo, about some of the events that are coming up. Jim?
Thank you, Bob. One of the things I just want to let you know is that there's a website, the eastham400.org, and that's going to be your reference for being able to find out what's happening, what's going on. We'll be able to download Dr. Saxine's book from there and get other information that's pertinent to the 400 and the commemoration. Some of the work that we've done is created a number of programs with different partners, and they'll all be on the events page and the calendar as those things come up. This year we have a number of talks. They're going to continue through next year, and they're going to be done not just by the 400, but they'll also be done by several of our partners, the Eastham Library, the Historical Association, events that will be put on by many other organizations, including the Eastham Painters Guild, a number of the church organizations that are in the area. So I think that you'll have a lot to work from. Some of the programs that the Eastham 400 Commemoration Committee is putting together on their own. This December 8th will be our commencement ceremony. It's the 399th anniversary of the Mayflower Expedition Party's encounter with the Nossets. And observances will be planned from different groups from sunrise to sunset. We'll also have a turn at the library. There'll be an observance there, and then refreshments later on at Chapel in the Pines. One of the big things that we're doing is the Sunset Series. That's going to be a daily occurrence just before sunset from Memorial Day to Labor Day, weather permitting, down at First Encounter Beach. And they'll talk about excerpts from Dr. Saxine's book, things that we've gotten from the Wampanoag Nation that are pertinent for Eastham. And we'll also have a campfire series that will be every Sunday in July and August next year. And that'll be a great time. That's going to be at dusk. And again, you can follow all these things on the 400, eastham400.org. We're planning on bringing the shallop, the Elizabeth Tilley, which is how all this happened, how the pilgrims came to Eastham. via this workboat, the Shallop. So we're pretty excited about that, and you'll be learning how it went from First Encounter Beach and ended up being the ones that actually, that's how they came up with Plymouth as their the location for the Plymouth colony. And we'll show the movie at some point that we still live here by Anne Makepeace. It's a great cultural revival for the Wampanoags, so we're really looking forward to that. And for the whole month of December, we'll have the Our Story, 400 Years of Wampanoag History. So with all these things that are planned, we'll end up closing out the year on December 8th, the 2020, with our closing ceremonies, and it will give us a chance to see what we've done, see where we came from, and where we're going to go for the future. So we hope you'll join us with all of that. We have commemorative articles that you'll be able to start getting in a few weeks. You can see the poster that's outside that was done by the artist Karen Ronaldo, who's here today with us. And also the commemoration ornament that was inspired by her work. So I think it gives us a chance to get a good idea of what's going to happen, and we should have enjoy being able to learn more about what happened in this history. Back to Bob.
Thank you, Jim. I think one of the things we're all going to learn as we move through this next year is just how special a place Eastham has in the history of the Pilgrims, perhaps more so than any other town outside of Provincetown. Eastham was central to the Pilgrims' existence here. And I've often thought, were it not for the first encounter, Eastham may have ended up America's hometown. Think about that. Well, as many of you know, we have had two versions of the first encounter on plaques near the beach itself. One describing Miles Standish and his band of pilgrims being attacked by a group of hostile Indians. Another, the one that's there now, says the Nauset tribe of the Wampanoag Nation, protecting their culture, had their first encounter with Miles Standish et al. So which is it? What actually did happen at the first encounter? Well, to explore that, our Eastham Public Library received a grant from Mass Humanities and the National Endowment for the Humanities. That a key part of the grant was commissioning an historian to prepare a fresh narrative of the first encounter. And that an important goal was to stimulate discussion throughout 2020. Now, what you will hear this morning is a result of that research by Dr. Ian Saxene. Dr. Saxene received his PhD from Northwestern University. He presently teaches U.S. history and British Atlantic World History at Bridgewater State University, and his research focuses on colonial and Native American history, especially in New England. His first book, Properties of Empire, Indians, Colonists, and Land Speculators on the New England Frontier, was published this year by NYU Press. Welcome, Dr. Saxene.
Thanks so much. Oop. This is tough for me. Nobody's ever told me to lower my voice, so microphones are. So thank you so much to everybody for being here. It's been a pleasure to see how many people in Easton want to come out and learn about the history of their community, and that's always exciting for somebody who works in the business of history. So get my timer started so I know when to shut up. The Nauset encounter, like Plymouth Colony in 1620, is a local story that can't be understood without looking at broader events. Yet at the same time, since 1620, many people have attempted to inflate these local actors and events into stand-ins for larger processes that these people were in fact not necessarily part of directly. And so we have, for example, the myth of the Mayflower Compact leading to the first Republican government, and the symbolism of the first Thanksgiving as some sort of harmonious morality play. recasting this small band of religious separatists and their fellow travelers into pioneers of Republican self-government or religious toleration is not true. Go to Rhode Island for religious toleration, Roger Williams. Right? So too, on the other side, it's not accurate to label these people merely as forerunners of manifest destiny, bound up with white American conceits of racial superiority, overcoming primitivism, right? All the actors that we're talking about today have become, arguably more than almost anybody in American history, turned into these cardboard cutouts and caricatures and statues. And so I saw my job as to try and figure out these people's experiences and the world as they saw it. So, the language that we use to tell these stories can never be completely unbiased, okay? Especially since the language and worldview of the colonizers has become widely shared. But we can do our best to avoid using language designed to flatter the feelings of one side or another, particularly, especially the colonizers, or to privilege their perspective, or to obscure the events that were happening. Therefore, several words should be out. One is settler, okay? To call the English people who moved here settlers implies that they were going somewhere that was wild and untamed, and that they were taming it, and they were settling it. But what would you call a group of people who came to Eastham and started shooting everybody and burning their houses down to build their own on top of them? That is many things, but it is not a settler, right? If anything, many of the English people who came to North America were in fact unsettling the places they moved to. So they were colonists, they were newcomers, sometimes they were invited, oftentimes they were not, but they were not settlers. Also, pilgrims. No, they did not call themselves pilgrims. 19th century Americans called them pilgrims. Okay, this is a latter-day honorific given to these people because it sounds better. Okay, they were religious separatists as well as fellow travelers. They understood themselves to be English. They understood themselves, the name for their own group was Brownist, because they were called Brownists by some of their contemporaries because they were admirers of the English separatist Richard Brown. And he was such an extremist that he himself renounced separatism after only 6 years and had in fact quit the Brownist movement, okay? That is to give you a sense of how marginalized and extreme these people were, but they were not pilgrims. And finally, first encounter, which this was very much not for many of the people involved. For the Nausets, 1620 was not the first encounter. So by calling this the first encounter, we are saying the perspective that really matters, that is worth commemorating, is the perspective of the people who are on the Mayflower. And obviously that is one of the perspectives there, and we're going to talk about it. So having thrown some cold water on so much mythology, I hasten to add that the reality is more interesting anyway. The Wampanoag and the separatists were infinitely more interesting than the cardboard cutouts that we have been given. So first, I want to spend a few minutes emphasizing the similarities between all of the participants in what was going on around 1620. All of them lived under what scholars call the biological old regime, meaning before 1800, people traveled by wind, water, and muscle power. That was it. There was no fossil fuels. Sources of energy and power were limited. Okay? Limited transportation and energy to preserve meant that food supplies for people were intensely seasonal, by our standards limited and monotonous. And most families, be they Wampanoags or English, lived only one bad harvest away from very difficult times. For most people, long distance travel was a risky proposition. Nobody traveled for fun, okay? Most people lived a very simple material life in relatively simple dwellings. They had relatively few material possessions, relatively few sets of clothes, things of that nature, okay? Most people were involved in food production. that they directly consumed or their nearby neighbors consumed. The vast majority of Wampanoags and English people, that is what they spent their time doing, is growing food, okay, and finding it. And for all of these people, their lived reality was one in which supernatural forces were at work, accounting for events like comets and eclipses. And successful people in life were people who made the right supplications to the correct spiritual forces to be able to give them good fortune in their endeavors. And Wampanoags and English alike had socially prescribed relationships based on distinctions on sex, age, and status. Now, that said, differences very much existed. The most fundamental stems from geography. What this map shows you are the origins of the major staple crops in human history. These are the origins of wild plants that people began domesticating many thousands of years ago. All the food that we eat, the overwhelming majority of the food that we eat, has been gradually modified and domesticated by human ingenuity. Modified from wild plants, okay? So wild corn, the ancestor of corn, for example, looks kind of like a cattail, and it's not particularly tasty. This took a lot of effort, many generations. Okay, notice where the origins of those major crops are. And here's a map of the earliest areas that in the world that humans built cities and settled down for sustained periods of time. Because the only way that you can support a city is to tend to crops, and that's an opportunity cost. You have to decide to devote your time to spending a lot of time on these very demanding plants. Anybody who keeps a garden or even house plants can appreciate this, right? To devote all of your time to the care and feeding of this stuff, you have to give up moving around. And so that is, of course, where the first cities grew up as well. Notice how there are no domesticable wild plants on a large scale that are indigenous to where we are, okay? The locally available plants were such things as cranberries and sunflowers. These are not exactly things that you want to build a city around, right? So it is not that the locals here were not interested in domesticating plants. It's they weren't stupid enough to try and build a Boston-sized city to grow cranberries, right? So they had to wait for corn to be selectively bred. Now notice here the shape of the continents. From China to the English Channel, you have relatively similar climate, okay? Similar pests, growing seasons, and whatnot. And so when some clever Chinese person figured out a new domesticated crop, this could be easily shared with people living east and west. In the Americas, this was not the case. You have different climate zones. You have different, and so the corn that developed in ancient Mexico had to be selectively bred to be able to thrive and survive in all of these different climate zones in the Americas. And so as a result, the Wampanoags and their neighbors did not start farming and domesticating corn until about the year 1300. Okay, and that was when Nauset women and other women of this region had developed the strains that would thrive in this climate. And so as a result, their population density was lower, and they were less urbanized than their neighbors further to the south, for example, in Mesoamerica and in Europe. All right. So by 1620, Nauset families on the Cape were taking advantage of the food package of the three sisters. That would be corn, beans, and squash that grew together in a particularly effective manner. But they continued to take advantage of maritime resources as well as hunting and gathering, okay? The Nausets were unusual in that they were even more sedentary than most other Wampanoag because the maritime resources on the coast were so rich. They did not move their fields every 17 to 20 years like many indigenous groups in northeastern North America did when there was surplus land where the soil had not been worn out. So compared to places with longer histories of large-scale agriculture, we should note the Wampanoags lived far less densely on the land. Villages like Pawtuxet, with perhaps 2,000 residents in 1615, dotted the landscape, but nowhere did they gather in numbers approaching the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan with like 150,000 people. In 1615, the Confederated network of villages led by Osamoquin Massasoit and the Poconoquets numbered anywhere between 12,000 and 25,000 people between the border of present-day Rhode Island and Cape Cod, and with the Massachusetts Indian villages around Massachusetts Bay boasting similar numbers. A European who visited the Nauset on the Cape in 1605 described cabins and gardens all along the coast of present-day Massachusetts. Each home was surrounded by sufficient open land for farming. Throughout the region, women were responsible for work in the villages, including tending to crops and gathering plants, for making baskets, mats, and medicine. Women also moved the family residence, weetus, or wigwams, as the seasonal needs demanded. Men performed tasks that took place outside of the village, so that would be deep sea fishing, hunting, trapping, diplomacy, and war. As with native groups throughout Eastern North America, this division of labor involved different types of spiritual power as well. The sort of rough division would be that women were in charge of life-giving responsibilities, and therefore their spiritual power was likely bent to those needs. Men, when necessary, took life to protect and support the community, be that hunting or war. The spiritual power that manifested itself in living things was called Manitou, which also existed in some inanimate objects as well as otherworldly beings. One of the best descriptions of how this works, and the sort of relative from the European perspective, lack of precision, comes from what an Ojibwe man told the anthropologist Irving Hallowell in the 1940s. Hallowell asked him if rocks were alive. And this old man thought for a while, and he answered, some are, okay? Most Native Americans living in this region, they were less troubled with the sort of precise taxonomies. And so when Roger Williams, the founder of Rhode Island, he tried to categorize all of the different apparitions that appeared in visions and the various culture heroes and objects of veneration among the local Native people. And he counted 37, and the fact that he tried to categorize them tells us as much about how English people viewed religion and life as about how the Wampanoags and their neighbors did, right? They were, shall we say, a little less, they were perhaps more comfortable with some levels of ambiguity. Okay? The Wampanoags sought to make sense of the unfamiliar through the spiritual world. But as Williams noted, they attributed Manitou, as he put it, to everything they cannot comprehend, and did not seem to be troubled by the unexplained the way that he was. The Wampanoags acknowledged diffuse sources of power, and they prized reciprocal, if not equal, relationships. Sachems, their word for their leaders, did not have the authority to command the obedience of their people in the manner that, say, European monarchs did. Their responsibilities included allocating land for use rights in the community, conducting diplomacy, and punishing severe crimes like murder. Sachems collected a modest amount of tribute from their followers, which they then redistributed in the form of gifts. To show off your prestige among the native peoples of this region, it was important how you dispensed your wealth and distributed your gifts rather than what you had per se. Scholars still dispute the extent of Sachem's power in this region, including the most famous one, Osamoquin Massasoit. So in the years before 1620, a sachem of the Poconoquets, based at Salwams, now Warren, Rhode Island, forged relationships with the villages of present-day southeastern Massachusetts, including the Nauset. His name was Osamoquin, and he's popularly known today by his title, Massasoit. Okay. For the members of this confederation, it had the advantage of protection from dangerous neighbors. Now, one group that this alliance did not pay much attention to was the European strangers who began arriving in the area around 1500 to fish and to trade. Some of these newcomers, they engaged in trade with the locals. Occasionally, a fight would break out between the sailors and the Indians, but it was more often than not reasonably amicable. The Wampanoags were far more worried about the Micmacs, who raided from up the coast in what's now Maine and Nova Scotia. In 1615, the Micmacs destroyed a village of Massasoit's allies down the coast, which would likely have worried him far more than the arrival of any English people in the early 1600s. But worse by far was a plague that broke out in 1616. One of the things that were not indigenous to the Americas were domesticable mammals. Okay? The large mammals indigenous to the Americas, North America in particular, were not suitable candidates for domestication. It's not that Native Americans never tried to domesticate bison by breeding them in captivity. It's that you can't do it with bison, and you get smashed and stampeded. Much in the same way that Africans are not stupid. It's not that they never tried to domesticate zebras, it's that zebras are jerks. Okay? There's very few wild animals that are suitable for domestication, that will breed in captivity. Okay? So most of the major epidemics in human history have arisen from our livestock. And so because they did not have livestock, Native peoples did not have any immunity to the big killers in human history, smallpox, influenza, things of that nature. Now this sickness in 1616 could have been the plague, the Black Death, but we don't know. What we do know is that it turned much of New England, where there had been thriving villages, it turned them into graveyards. And so, for example, the village of Patuxet, which is the site of modern-day Plymouth, it had about 2,000 residents, give or take, in 1615. By 1620, it was completely abandoned. Almost everybody in it had died, the survivors had moved away. And up to 90% of some indigenous communities died during this 3-year epidemic. Survivors consolidated in villages, reformed bonds, and so many of the political groupings which the English encountered after 1620 were really composed of the fragments of these surviving communities. So for them, the plague would have been far more portentous of an event than the arrival of the Mayflower off their coast in 1620. All right, how about those newcomers? So, in a tract written to justify the Plymouth colonist venture, Robert Cushman lamented the absence of any land like, as he put it, the Jews had a Canaan, being legally holy and appropriated unto a holy people. Unfortunately for Cushman and the separatists in England, we are in all places strangers and pilgrims, travelers and sojourners most properly, having no dwelling but this earthen tabernacle. Our dwelling is but a wandering. And it is that line which 19th century writers snatched up and said, aha, they're pilgrims. Sounds good, right? But this is not something that they sort of dwelled on in the 17th century. So who were these people? We should note, not all of the colonists to Plymouth were religious separatists, but the venture would not have happened without them. And Plymouth Colony was, until its absorption into Massachusetts Bay in 1691, primarily a vehicle for their ambitions, however frustrated. These folks and their colony were a bundle of fascinating paradoxes. They were very proud to be English. They did not want to leave England, but they had to, because their religious separatism was against the law. They modeled Plymouth Colony's laws on English common law. A committee in Plymouth tasked with codifying the colony's laws in 1636 reported back in part that, as freeborn subjects of the state of England, we here came endowed with all singular privileges belonging to such. And they believed that it needed no real elaboration. And they went and made various modifications that they saw fit, particularly to make sure that the law of their colony was more informed directly by scripture than English common law had been. These separatists were very much not seeking religious toleration only, or they would have remained in the Netherlands where they had taken shelter. Instead, these people were super patriotic English people who were worried that their kids were becoming Dutch and becoming, like all immigrants everywhere, they worried that their children would forget where they came from and would lose their roots. And so their decision to come here was in part based on this desire to carry out God's will as they saw it whilst remaining English. Okay? In 1620, England was not a wealthy and powerful country. It did not even have control over, let me see here, did not even have control over the entire island of Great Britain at the time. It was a relatively small, not particularly powerful kingdom in 1620. But English people were very proud of their home and where they were from. Now, one of the greatest sources of English pride was in fact their church and its roots in the Protestant Reformation. And by 1620, one of the reasons that the separatists felt that they had to leave was because most people in English were so captivated by their church as this source of English pride and identity and patriotism. And by breaking away from that church, the separatists were in fact defying the authority of their Lord and Sovereign, their King. But the separatists, they loved the Protestant Reformation that had inspired the Church of England. They just loved it more than everybody else, so much that they had to leave it. Now we should note, nobody wanted religious toleration in around 1620. Okay, that was not a goal, because religious toleration meant that you lost, and meant that you could not convince your neighbors to give up their sinful ways and carry out, again, God's will. So for those of you who might have forgotten this from school, it's very fine. The Protestant Reformation, okay, which gave us everybody who's not Catholic and Orthodox, basically, it spawned a number of different churches, right? There's not a single Protestant church. And the most important feature of the Protestant Reformation is that the Pope is no longer in charge. Protestants were separating themselves from the Catholic hierarchy, and they emphasized the importance of reading Scripture as the Word of God. Okay? The Church of England was descended from that, okay? Now, the problem was that the Church of England was a political creation. It was inspired by King Henry VIII's fundamental belief that he deserved to divorce his wife and marry somebody who would give him a son and a legitimate heir, and he would figure out the details later. And so the English spent about 150 years figuring out exactly how Protestant their Church of England was going to be. They killed a lot of people over this question, all right? And so you might have heard the term Puritan. Puritans were people in England. They made up the vast majority of the religious colonists who moved to this region. Okay, Puritans were English Protestants who believed the Church of England had not reformed enough to get out all the incense, all the Catholic hierarchy, all the tradition, all the idolatry, okay? And they were much more common. Now the separatists basically agreed with the Puritans. William Bradford in his own narrative says, they called us Puritans as an insult, okay? The separatists who moved here would have identified as Puritans in a certain way. Eventually they had come to accept this term in the same way that an insult like Jesus freaks, some Christians have just sort of said, yeah, we are, right? That's what they call us. So that was where Puritan started as an insult, okay? The difference between Puritans and the separatists who came here, Puritans wanted to stay in the Church of England and clean it out. These separatists believed there was no longer any hope that it was a true church. Now, specifically, the God that directed their lives was a severe one. They believed that all of humanity was forever tainted, irrevocably tainted by original sin, and that everybody deserved eternal damnation. Fortunately, God in his infinite mercy had chosen some people to be plucked from the flames. So you should not feel it's unfair that most people are damned. You should feel grateful that you, unworthy you, might in fact not be, okay? Now, this was a very stressful way to go about one's life, because here's the kicker. Nothing you could do would change this. Nothing you did mattered in that sense. Only belief mattered. However, how do you know if you're saved or not? People who are saved usually do good things and are successful in life. And so it's true that donating food to canned food drives and helping old ladies cross the street will not change God's mind and get you into heaven. By doing those things, you are providing evidence that you are among the saved. And that is the evidence you presented to get membership into a church. You had to go to church anyway, that's the law. But to go to church and be saved and be a member, you had to prove that you had this sort of experience, that evidence that you were among the elect. So it was here's the thing though. So why don't you just sin and go to the tavern and spend your days drinking and having fun? Because God will smite you now, that's why. Puritans love to tell stories about how the whorehouse collapsed, killing everybody inside, or how the Johnsons skipped church and had a picnic and then a bear ate them. That's proof that God is active in our lives, right? So for the separatists, they were separating themselves from these ungodly churches so that they could build what we today would call an intentional community, right? Where they could mind each other and walk the straight and narrow. To live in this world, as they put it, with one's gazed firmly on the next. And so, after 1600 or so, a new king of England, James I, he grew tired of these challenges to his authority from these Puritans and especially these separatists. And he said, if these people do not obey me, I will harry them out of the land. A 12-year-old boy living in Yorkshire named William Bradford learned the difficulty of this life for himself. He joined after hearing the Reverend Richard Clifton preach about the need for further reformation, he joined a separatist underground congregation in Scrooby, led by Clifton and another man named John Robinson. And they had to flee to the Dutch Republic, which was itself illegal in 1607 and 1608. The Netherlands had religious toleration. They were also a republic. Okay. But again, as we mentioned, the English feared after a number of years, besides the fact that their skills, they had been farmers, and there wasn't a lot of farming work to be had in the Netherlands, so they worked sort of odd jobs and menial labor. So then ironically, these people, by 1620, many of them were no longer farmers when they came to America, and so they had to relearn farming again, this sort of new generation. So they decided that they would sail to the northern reaches of the Virginia Patent, far away from Jamestown, the first permanent English colony in North America, and they would settle right at the northern tip where the green intersects the blue line there, okay, the bluish green line. Now, why did the English feel that they had a right to just sail and take up residence in somebody else's home? Several reasons. The separatists, like other English people, described the American continent as vast and unpeopled, okay, while also fruitful and fit for habitation, being devoid of all civil inhabitants, where there are only savage and brutish men, which range up and down, little different than the wild beasts. So by moving to this vast and empty chaos, as Richard Cushton put it, this is the guy who called them pilgrims at one point, the English were arguing that the way that you demonstrate ownership of land, real ownership, is you have to have a form of law the English recognized as granting you real property rights. And in English law, you demonstrate property by building a dwelling house that you live in all year round, by planting crops, and by enclosing your land with a fence, and then raising domesticated animals in the English way. And if you don't do that, you're doing it wrong. And it's not real property. The English made this argument against the Irish in the 16th century and in the 17th century. And they made the same argument as Native Americans. And so when they saw indigenous networks of property of these group use rights and these overlapping hunting and fishing and farming rights between different groups, the English said, nah, we'll give you the fields, but everything else is commons, it's wasteland. It's free for grabs, and we'll take that. And it's fine, because we're so good at farming, we'll show you how to do it better, so it's better for everybody. It's fine. So that was their justification here. Also, rumors of disease, which were included in the Plymouth Council to New England's patent language in 1620, mentioned there was a wonderful plague that had depopulated the country, leaving it cleared away for them. So the Plymouth colonists set sail later in the year in 1620 than they planned. From the get-go, from 1620 on, the Plymouth enterprise was always kind of a shoestring affair. They had to sell some of their supplies to pay their debts off to get out of port. Okay, they never secured a patent to have a colony. A patent is like a royal permission slip that says the King of England says you can be here. And as we will see, the Mayflower landed outside of the Virginia patent. That New England patent of 1620 was granted to somebody else. For their entire history, the Plymouth colonists did not have a legal right to be where they were. They never got it. And their entire history, they were living in this legal limbo. And they debated how hard they should try to get this royal permission slip to be where they were. But this should also color how we interpret these land exchanges and their dealings with the native people, because any history that just takes it as an assumption that the separatists had a right to be there, and obviously they're just going to start buying land and granting land to everybody. They had no legal right to grant land to anybody, and they did it for 70 years. The separatists left without something else that was important. They did not bring their minister, John Robinson, because like most of the separatists, they didn't want to come here because it is scary and far away. And so John Robinson stayed with the bulk of the congregation in the Netherlands, whilst a minority climbed aboard the Mayflower and sailed west in the fall of 1620. John Robinson, much to the disappointment of the colonists, never joined them. He died in 1625. It is unclear if he ever would have come here. He kept saying, oh, soon, I'll get there eventually, and he never did it. And this is another important point to note. The Plymouth colony, one of the obstacles they faced is not only were there not very many separatists, but they couldn't even convince their entire congregation to come over. They never had enough colonists. And so they were always making deals and trying to convince other people who did not believe in the full extent of their mission to come and live in their colony anyway. And that shaped the kind of society they were able to build, because they were never able to construct the kind of rigid, godly discipline that, say, Massachusetts Bay and Connecticut was able to do, because Massachusetts and Connecticut brought over 20,000 Puritans, a critical mass of people. Plymouth colony, after 10 years, had 300 inhabitants. Not even all of them were members of the now transplanted Scrooby congregation. Okay. So the passengers on the Mayflower, there were about just under 150 people on board. This includes about 30 sailors, give or take. The separatists made up only about half of the passenger total, though, on board. Okay. Now, when they landed outside of the bounds of the Virginia patent, a lot of the passengers started to get nervous. Some of the non-separatists started making noises about moving off and starting their own venture. And so that was when the passengers of the Mayflower signed a covenant, which later generations called the Mayflower Compact. And what this agreement was they agreed that they would choose their own governor and then do whatever he said and obey the laws and basically not kill each other and separate. Okay? It was a fairly rudimentary sort of survival agreement. Okay? It was not a Republican document. The compact itself, we should call it a covenant. That's how they would have understood it. Puritans talked very much about covenants with God and agreements, right? And the gist of it was, though, they mentioned the king in the document. They were very much not trying to break away from England. They were very much English people carrying out English laws and, of course, building their own godly church in this new world to them. Okay. So for the Nausets, the meaningful first encounter was probably in 1614, when Captain Thomas Hunt kidnapped 20 Pawtuxet residents and 7 Nausets for sale as slaves. Later, Plymouth colonists encountered a woman who was still grieving the kidnapping of her 3 sons, and who couldn't look at English people without sobbing. So the Nausets were understandably still very anti-English at 1620. And so this undoubtedly colored their encounter with the newcomers. Now, there were 3 shore parties that the Mayflower sent ashore in November and December of 1620. And the so-called first encounter was the last, it was the third of them. So on November 15th, in the old style of the calendar, the first shore party sailed ashore in the shallop that they had. It was a smaller ship, okay? And they were not looking for a fight, but they were dressed like it. They were wearing armor, they were carrying weapons, and they were all men. And so from the Nauset perspective, this did not look particularly friendly, for context here. Miles Standish, a veteran of wars in Europe, led the first party, which was spotted by Nausets who fled. The English followed them but failed to catch up. Standish's party found no native people, but they did locate a source of fresh water, evidence of recently harvested fields, a buried store of corn, and a gravesite. They took the corn in an iron kettle, which the native people had, in a home. And then they planned, according to published accounts, to compensate the residents they met later. And they left the graves undisturbed. Because, as William Bradford put it, we thought it would be odious to ransack their sepulchres. Okay. A second short party of 34 men returned on November 28th. The ship was running out of food. They'd had to sell some of their provisions, as we noted, to pay for the voyage. And they hadn't found a suitable place to settle for the winter. The second shore party failed to find a harbor, but did return to dig up more food supplies in the Nausets' food storage areas. Okay? They took 10 bushels of corn, and instead of a village, they found what one writer called a place like a grave, but bigger than any they had ever seen before. They began to dig and discovered woven mats, bowls, trays, dishes, and such things. And they found the bones of several people. And they, as the account says, brought sundry of the prettiest things away from us, from the gravesite. Further digging revealed still more graves, and 2 sailors from the party found 2 empty houses full of dishes, decorated baskets, baskets of parched acorns and fish, and they took that with them too. We should note William Bradford's later history of Plymouth omits this grave robbing side of the first the second shore party here. Now, the passengers continued to debate where to land permanently, and so on December 6th, a third party went ashore. 10 of the leading separatists and 8 sailors. By now, most of the Nauset must have been aware of the English presence, although not of their intent. And so at some point, the Nauset likely prepared for war. Aspinet was the local sachem, and he and his war leaders likely performed the ritual practical and ritual preparations. As the third English party walked through yet another burying place, searching for more corn. On the night of December 7th to the 8th, the English heard a cry that they thought was wolves or foxes. But then at dawn, the Nausets attacked them, when the English were divided between their shallop and their camp, and not all near their weapons. Now, the English had also built a barricade on the beach, which was practical, but also, again, does not suggest that they were, to the Nausets anyway, that they were there with friendly intentions. And so the first encounter was a brief firefight between the Nausets and the English, an exchange of largely bow and arrows and then matchlock firearms that the colonists were carrying. So a matchlock was literally a big musket where it was fired by touching a lit match to a tray full of gunpowder, which then went bang. And so soldiers had to run around carrying lengths of slow-burning match with them into battle. It was very cumbersome. And so the colonists' guns were certainly not their greatest technological advantage. In fact, a number of the colonists who were stuck by the shallop, who were loading it, their guns were not lit. And so one of the most dramatic passages in the account of this fight is when somebody from the camp had to run with a burning log from the fire to the boat so they could light their matches and shoot back. The colonists' biggest advantage was probably their steel swords and their armor, which would have come in handy had the Nausets tried to close for hand-to-hand combat, but they did not. Because for the Nauset, like other Algonquin-speaking Native Americans, successful war leaders were not ones who spent the lives of their fighters frivolously. And so it was not a victory if you needlessly lost lives on your own side without good cause. And so after a firefight of an undetermined length, the chroniclers don't tell us how long it was, the Nausets eventually withdrew. But assessing this first encounter, both sides claimed a victory. The English said, well, the Indians ran away, and so therefore we won. We chased them away and we proved that we didn't run away. But then the English got on their boat and they left. So from the Nauset perspective, that exactly is what they wanted to do, is they wanted to make these people go away. So everybody got what they wanted. right? All right. So after this encounter, okay, the separatists sailed and found a harbor in Plymouth. They went there. Very quickly, the return to Nauset and then Eastham occurred later. So the next major encounter occurred in 1621 when the Nauset returned an English boy who got lost in the woods. His name was John Billingham. And they returned him to the Plymouth colonists in a delegation, okay, showing their strength, 100 men massed behind Aspinet to show that they in fact were not forced to do this. But after that, Nauset went from being sort of standing out for its sort of anti-English sentiment to a situation in which the Cape Cod indigenous people enjoyed better relations with the colonizers than most of their other neighbors. And this is largely because they remained physically remote from the concentrated areas of English colonization. So after 1630, many of the Puritans from Massachusetts Bay moved to Plymouth Colony, and they founded a number of towns. Eastham stands out because it is the only other town in Plymouth Colony that was founded by the Plymouth separatists themselves. And this very much surprised me when I learned this, when I was doing the research for this project. The founding of Eastham was a disappointment for Bradford, for William Bradford, the governor of Plymouth, and for most of the other separatists, because their community was breaking apart. Even if they couldn't build this whole colony on their model, right? They thought they could keep the congregation together, but there wasn't enough good land in Plymouth for all of them. And so they initially went and surveyed the village of Nauset, which became Eastham. And after surveying this land, they paid the local residents something for it. But then when they decided to move here, they realized it could only fit maybe 25 English families, and that wasn't enough. They hadn't surveyed it right. And so 7 families went anyway. And William Bradford writes about this, and he's very sad about it all. So Eastham itself, we don't know. The origins of how the payment went, we're a little unclear on. Okay? If there was a legal deed in 1644, it hasn't survived. And so instead what happened is the proprietors drafted a declaration of right and interest after 1651 and just stuck it into the colony records. But it has no legal standing. They just wrote something that says, we totally have a right to be here, please acknowledge this colony. Okay? The deed that is displayed by this town, right, was signed November 9th, 1666, when the town proprietors obtained a signature from the leading Nausets. Now, the last sort of comments I'll make is evaluating fairness of these land exchanges is difficult here, right? We can look for evidence like the land is not measured in English acres, but rather using physical markers on the landscape. There's indigenous use rights retained, those sorts of things. But another event in context that was happening that shaped why the Nauset likely would have sold is that by this time, English livestock was running wild over the countryside, devouring their crops and making most of the common land that was not in native villages useless for their subsistence networks. And so the English land use practices made it so that most of the Cape was becoming much less useful for the Nauset land use practices. And so their strategy involved a certain amount of retrenchment. And the Cape Indians gradually concentrated in what is now the town of Mashpee. And these towns like Mashpee, which became known as praying towns, they decided that for reasons of accommodation, they would get obtain the guardianship of colonial or other protectors. And they would get some form of some English blessing or legal legitimacy onto an indigenous community maintaining its resource base and network of indigenous property and allowing them to maintain some independence within this English network. And so the rise of Eastham, which was incorporated in 1651, and that's when the English people changed the name of Nauset to Eastham, much like English colonists change other local names to familiar names to them. But the rise of Eastham happened at the same time as the often relocation of indigenous people to their own communities, so Mashpee. So Eastham and Mashpee are very much twinned communities in a way that the 19th century histories do not acknowledge. All right, so I'm going to close this, speeding up here. I want to note, first of all, Native people did not vanish from Eastham. There's records of indigenous residents of Eastham all the way through the end of the 18th century. And they moved right down the road. And so the supposed absence of Native peoples in New England after the American Revolution is not a real absence, but it is a writing away of them. And so if you read Enoch Pratt's history of Eastham and the neighboring towns, published in 1844, he just kind of says, oh, everybody's gone, and they just sort of vanish from the narrative. Bridgewater, where I work, in 1856, Governor of Massachusetts Emory Washburn delivered an account of that town's purchase from Osamoquin, Massasoit, observing, "It is sad to think that of all that race who then peopled this region, nothing but tradition now remains. No descendants of them are to be found in the veins of any living being." Of course, that's not true. They're right down the road in Mashpee, right? In fact, some of those descendants were prospering in Mashpee, others were struggling. But in the 19th century, they were in fact fighting to retain their independence and control of their town. And so they invited another newcomer to the region. His name was William Apis. He was a Pequot missionary, he was a Christian, and he led what was known as the Mashpee Revolt, in which he criticized the state of Massachusetts and the United States for trampling over Native peoples and pretending that they no longer lived or existed. He did some time in one of the local jails for violating some sort of peace ordinance. But what Apis and real flesh and blood Indians got in the way of was this narrative that Pratt and other historians these other writers were attempting to construct. The people constructing this included the General Society of Mayflower Descendants, founded in 1897, who even today claim in a mission statement of their intent to educate how the Pilgrims shaped Western civilization, which is itself a hazy 19th century concept that has no real historical use today. And so the narrative that these writers tried to construct would have made very little sense to the original separatists, who did not believe they were founding a new country. They did not believe they were founding a republican government. That was not their goal. This was a relatively small band of fairly extreme, devoted Christians, right, who were trying to form what, again, we might call an intentional community and wanted to be left alone as proud English people. And it was in the early days of the United States and in the 19th century that groups like the General Society of Mayflower Descendants transformed the Plymouth colonists into pilgrims. Okay? They transformed this covenant into the Mayflower Compact. They wrote a history that turned the Plymouth colony into this beacon, a morality play, and a bedtime story, which is very much at odds with the historical account. Turning separatists into pilgrims served other agendas as well. For white Americans then as now, unhappy with the importance of African slavery to the economy and society of colonial America, venerating the so-called pilgrims as the true forefathers of the United States could marginalize the unsavory aspects of the past and present of the nation. The real Plymouth colony, of course, had allowed and even profited from slavery, but the commemorations erased that too. The actual separatists who in their fussy and factious and even utopian vision of godly society could hardly convince their entire congregation, let alone a colony full, to join them in their particular enterprise. And they made unsuitable candidates as the forefathers of an expansionist republic, embracing the ideals of religious pluralism and individual rights for all. But the pilgrims constructed in the 19th century were infinitely more malleable. They could serve as forerunners of manifest destiny while becoming an essential part of an idealistic narrative about the United States in general, and New England in particular, that has outlived the open racist assumptions that accompanied its 19th century articulation. And that narrative contained an important thread about indigenous people. And it goes something like this. The colonists arrived in a nearly vacant wilderness, and the remaining native people vanished, slain by disease. Unavoidable, nothing else. But not before signing away their lands in fair exchanges and which many New England towns preserve to this day as proof of this founding. And in any case, those native people did not farm, wandering over the landscape like so many deer, as 19th century Americans like to tell themselves, including, by the way, on the Supreme Court, which in a ruling in 1823, which is still standing, nullified the idea of collective indigenous property rights in the United States. I would argue that it is important we acknowledge that 1620 was in no way a first encounter, in the same way that we acknowledge that a last encounter has not happened yet. Native New England is not limited to a dead past, and reckoning with the real legacies of the real descendants of all participants is a challenge that we can only face if we pay attention to the real people that walked here so long ago. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saxene, and I don't imagine anyone has any questions. Yes?
So, I'm just curious how you would describe William Bradford and what your opinion is of him. That's my first question. Second would be, if you could create a slogan for the 400th commemoration, what would that be?
Okay, so the first question is your opinion of William Bradford, and the second is if you could create a slogan for the 400th commemoration, what would it be?
Here, I can go with this one. So William Bradford, he's an interesting guy. Some people who will think that, you know, because I work to dismantle the Pilgrim Industrial Complex, as I call it, that I dislike the people or I'm not interested in the separatists, and that's not true. I think that Bradford was clearly a talented leader. He was elected governor almost continuously for like 30 years or something like that, close to that. And he was a valuable historian, and he was, by all accounts, a sort of principled person who did his job as best he could, right, to hold this colony together. So that's my, I suppose, my opinion of him as far as it goes. I don't have a particularly strong one about him, to be completely honest with you. I hope that's not a letdown. As far as a slogan for this, well, I clearly you've heard my thoughts about a first encounter. So either something about Nauset encounters, or paths from Nauset. I mean, that was my sort of working theme in this narrative. Something along those lines. I suppose I would be really curious to hear what other citizens of this community thought. As I viewed my job as to try and construct the most faithful narrative I could, so that the Eastham citizenry could make what meaning of it they felt was most relevant to their time and place.
Yes.
When you were researching this, did you come across, on the native side, any sort of, I don't want to say mythology, but oral tradition of what happened?
The question is there any evidence on the Native American side of an oral tradition or telling of the first encounter story?
Not a sort of verbatim one, and so there were several Mashpee consultants who were very helpful, Paula and Stephen Peters, and so they helped me correct several errors of fact. They did tell me that certainly in their community, but one of the longest lasting oral traditions is that the land deeds were a bad deal, that they universally mock some of these early Wampanoags for getting swindled from their perspective, right? And certainly knowing now what the English would have paid other English people for the land, and when they became aware of that has become part of their telling of this. Other Wampanoag I've talked to, some of them are very skeptical that there were Native people who voluntarily converted to Christianity, but there were. And so that has, because of various sort of political and social tribulations that their communities have gone under, that of course has for them made them, again, suspicious of 17th century native peoples who might be interested in, for example, what some of these missionaries had to say.
Someone else? Yes.
Have any people challenged your assessment of the demise of history?
Has anyone challenged your assessment of this history?
Always and constantly. So I have not received direct feedback from anybody walking up to me or anything like in this project. I was made aware that apparently the Society of Mayflower Descendants did not endorse this narrative. I was not aware of their interpretation until I went to their website yesterday. And I do not endorse their website, so I'm okay with them not endorsing this narrative. I think they do very valuable work gathering information about the Mayflower, the people on the Mayflower, and they're a valuable repository of genealogical information. I looked at the resources they provide classrooms and their bedtime stories, and they are grotesque distortions of 17th century history, which I think are not befitting of either the separatists or the other colonists or the native people. And I don't think it helps anybody, because when school children are told bedtime stories and then they hear other things they were not told, then they just become cynical. And I don't think that helps anybody. And so I'm aware that I was not apparently deferential enough to the so-called Pilgrim Fathers, and by not using the correct nomenclature in those terms. And that's fair, and I'm happy to defend my choices. I was certainly not out to do a half job on anybody, but it is not the job of the historian to make anybody feel good. And I want to be clear that I received very valuable assistance from several Mashpees, but they did not editorially endorse everything I wrote. And this is not, well, nobody did in that sense. I take full responsibility for that. And so this is certainly, I was nobody's stenographer either, I should just say that. And that I suspect that there are some Wampanoag who are not happy, or who would have told the story differently. So I certainly did not just tell one group's sort of side of the story, if you will.
Yes.
Is there a book about the Wampanoag written from their point of view?
Is there a book about the Wampanoag written from their point of view?
There is not an auto history that I'm aware of in the way that, for example, there is of like the Abenaki. But to be clear, there's not a single Wampanoag point of view either. I mean, they are also, they have their own community divides and interpretations as any do, right? Generally speak, so for example, when the Peterses were asking me what I was consulting, and I told them I was reading Kathleen Bragdon's study of southern New England native peoples from the 1500s and 1600s, and Neil Salisbury's Manitou and Providence. They were very pleased, and those are probably the sort of highest recommended ones. But there's not a sort of single volume that is authorized that I'm aware of.
Over here.
I was interested and surprised when you said the Plymouth colony really never grew much beyond 300 people. What accounted for that while other
Sure.
areas were growing?
Why didn't the Plymouth colony grow to more than 300?
So to be clear, that was the first decade. By 1691, when Massachusetts Bay absorbed this yellow area on the map that you see, there were about 7,000 people living, colonists living inside of the Plymouth colony. The reason is, part of it was that, again, the farmland in this area is not as rich as elsewhere in New England. The major ports were Boston and Salem. And so Plymouth, for the 17th century, became something of an economic backwater. And so for people who wanted to make a buck, there was, of course, Massachusetts, and then we should note, the majority of English colonists went to the Caribbean. That's where the money was. Just most of them died because that's where the disease was too. This went for the Puritans as well. We should note that New England Puritans, when they went elsewhere in the Caribbean, they bought slaves, they tried to plant sugar and tobacco, and they tried to get rich like everybody else. And so in large part, the New England society that arose was as much a product of New England geography as it was of the sort of social organization that these people had. So Plymouth did grow, but much more slower. And the fact that the colony was sort of in legal limbo certainly didn't help it, right? And the Puritans, I was very surprised to learn this, the Puritans and Connecticut, so the Puritans in Massachusetts and Connecticut, were much more active and efficient about getting a godly ministry and sort of really enforcing church discipline and carrying out the kinds of reforms that Bradford and his companions would have liked to do on a colony-wide scale had they been able to. But they just never had the critical mass of the population to do it. So they had to be satisfied with doing it in Plymouth town itself.
So Bob,
Two more questions?
yes, back there.
Who is responsible for setting up the framework for these land deals or land swaps?
Who is responsible for setting up the framework for these land deals?
So this is a very complex question that I'll try and give a brief, coherent answer to. The first thing is that New England towns could never all agree exactly where their source of title came from. Did it come from the king and then indigenous people were confirming that? Did it come from the indigenous people and the king was just a necessary sort of hat tip? Was it a colony grant, which then the Indians were confirming? They never all sat down to agree with it. And so different New England towns have different origin titles and deeds. And historians have kind of gone round and round on this. The best book on this to date is Alan Greer's new one called Property and Dispossession. And it's about this question of property formation in the Americas, looking at New England and Canada and Mexico. My own work, Properties of Empire, looks at this question a little bit in what's now Maine, right? But it was this very confusing issue that there was not an agreed on answer to. But by 1700, many New Englanders has come to believe it was important to root their land, their property rights in Indian deeds because it gave them some measure of independence from the crown.
Okay, one last question? Yes.
How close or far off are the actors at Plymouth Plantation based on your analysis?
What was that again? How far?
How accurate are the Plymouth Plantation folks? You should go to Plymouth Plantation, it's great. They know far more than I could ever know. I am by no means, I could never hope to amass the lifetime of knowledge that these people have. And Plymouth Plantation is a wonderful museum. And they have Wampanoag input, they have excellent sort of historical analysis and research, and so they're wonderful. You should, as far as I know, they're spot on, as far as anybody can be that we know.
I want to thank you all. This has been absolutely fascinating and great work, Dr. Saxene. I just want to mention that the next